Wind moves first. It comes off the body hills without resistance. No trees tall enough to slow it. No terrain shaped to shelter what was built here. It crosses the ridgeline, drops into the valley, and runs straight through the town as if the streets were laid out to receive it. Wooden facades stand in a single file along Main Street, tall, squared, and hollow behind their false fronts. Glass is missing from upper windows. Doors hang slightly open. Inside, counters, shelves, and iron safes remain, left where use stopped. Nothing about the layout suggests permanence. Bodie sits at 8,300 feet above sea level, too high for agriculture, too cold for stability, too distant for diversified trade. Every structure was positioned for proximity to shafts, mills, water lines, and freight routes. The town was not placed here to grow. It was placed here to function. Gold was discovered in 1859. Within a year, claims were formalized and extraction began. What followed was not settlement, but industrial staging, timber hauled in, mills erected, boarding houses raised close to the mines. Then fire came, more than once. Entire blocks vanished, and each time rebuilding followed. Not because the town mattered, but because the ore still did. From above, Bodie does not look abandoned. It looks paused. Interiors remain staged by last use. Desks mid-ledger, bottles mid-shelf, tools mid-placement. The stillness carries no nostalgia, only the residue of function. Because from the beginning, Bodie was engineered for a single outcome, the removal of value from the ground beneath it. And once that equation turned, staying here was never part of the design. Gold did not build Bodie. Incentive did. The first discovery came in July 1859, placer gold traced along the creeks and gravel beds of the Body Hills by William Miss Bodie and E.S. Taylor. It was not a deep strike, not an engineered operation, just surface gold, the kind that draws men faster than infrastructure can follow. Bodie himself would not see what followed. He died that same winter, crossing the mountains in a snowstorm, months before the district that carried his name formally existed. On July 10, 1860, the Bodie Mining District was organized, mapped, claimed, and governed under California mining law. Boundaries were drawn, claims registered, disputes assigned to district authority. The ground was no longer open terrain. It was segmented industrial property. The early claims moved quickly from placer to quartz. Surface gold suggested deeper systems. Veins were staked along Bodie Bluff, among them the Montauk, later known as the Goodshaw claim. These were not temporary diggings. They required shafts, hoisting works, crushing mills. Extraction shifted from individual prospectors to capital-backed operators almost immediately. By 1863, consolidation had already begun. Adjacent claims merged into the Bodie Bluff. Consolidated Mining Company, presided over by Leland Stanford, a sitting governor and railroad magnate. Corporate structure arrived before the town itself had stabilized. Ownership concentrated early. Investment followed geology, not population. And population remained thin. Through the 1860s, Bodie was barely a settlement. In 1865, only 14 small houses stood, wood frame or adobe, scattered near the bluff. Elections across the district recorded roughly 20 votes per year between 1860 and 1877. There were no dense neighborhoods, no civic grid, just structures placed where shafts demanded labor. The town did not grow outward. It clustered inward, tight to the extraction zone. Tents served as housing where permanent walls were unjustified. Boarding houses expanded only when shifts increased. Buildings appeared in response to ore confirmation, not family arrival. Even early commerce, supply stores, blacksmith sheds unexisted to service mines, not residents. Everything was provisional. Even claim ownership reflected instability. Titles were governed through district courts because boundaries were contested constantly. Veins pinched, widened, faulted. A productive claim could collapse in value within months. Investment moved accordingly, fluid, cautious, temporary. Water shortages limited early expansion. Ore could not be processed without it. Mills stalled. Steam systems idled. Lack of water suppressed output long before labor shortages did. Infrastructure lagged behind incentive, a pattern that would define Bodie's entire operational life. Still, capital stayed interested, because geological surveys confirmed something critical. The gold was not isolated. Vein systems ran deep through Bodie Bluff. Rich ore bodies were present but required scale to extract. The transition from camp to system began quietly here. Years before the boom most histories focus on, small operators gave way to incorporated companies. Hand tools gave way to steam drills. Tents gave way to frame buildings aligned to hoisting works. By the early 1870s, Bodie was no longer a prospecting camp. It was an extraction site waiting for its expansion phase. The moment when output would justify the infrastructure required to sustain it. And that moment came fast. In April 1877, the Standard Mining Company, Incorporated, capitalized to industrialize the district's richest veins. Within a year, its first ore shipments confirmed what investors had anticipated. Bodie was not a marginal field. It was a high-yield system entering peak productivity. From that point forward, growth stopped being organic. It became mechanical. Dozens of firms entered simultaneously, and between 30 and 50 companies operating by Bodie's peak around 1880. Shafts multiplied across the hills. Mills expanded. Freight lines strained to keep pace with timber and machinery demand. Population surged, not because Bodie had become livable, but because labor was now required at industrial scale. Housing rose fast with cheap lumber, false fronts, shallow foundations. Main Street extended nearly a mile, lined with commercial facades designed for speed, not endurance. Nothing about the expansion suggested permanence. Buildings were erected with the understanding they would last only as long as ore returns, justified their maintenance. Even banks and newspapers, institutions often tied to civic stability, were established here to manage mining capital, not to root the town socially. The economic logic was simple. As long as gold output exceeded operational cost, Bodie expanded. If output slowed, expansion stopped. No secondary industry emerged to buffer fluctuation. No agricultural belt developed. No transport corridor independent of mining freight formed. Every system, labor, housing, commerce, law enforcement, derived funding directly or indirectly from extraction margins. The town had no economic insulation, only throughput. Even labor structure reflected volatility. Miners arrived seasonally, transient, overwhelmingly male. Supporting trades, merchants, carpenters, blacksmiths, existed to service them. A Chinese workforce, several hundred strong by 1878, was confined largely to service labor, laundries, charcoal production, wood cutting, essential but structurally segregated roles within the mining economy. Unionization arrived early on miners. Union Local 61 formed December 22, 1877, not as social organization, but as wage stabilization within a system already compressing labor costs against infrastructure expansion. Because even at peak incentive, Bodie was expensive to run. Timber had to be hauled long distances. Freight climbed mountain routes. Steam boilers consumed wood at industrial scale. Water systems required constant extension. Everything that made extraction possible also eroded profit margins. Which meant from the moment Bodie accelerated into boom, the countdown toward cost imbalance had already begun. Discovery had not created a town. It had activated a mechanism. One that expanded only under pressure from ore output, and one that would contract just as mechanically when that pressure dropped. Bodie did not begin as a place people intended to stay. It began as a response to what lay underground, temporary by design, scalable by necessity, and already bound to the limits of the resource that justified its existence. Bodie's expansion did not happen when gold was found. It happened when extraction became efficient enough to justify permanence in machinery, not in people. By 1877, the Standard Mining Company entered the district with a scale Bodie had not yet seen. Incorporation meant capital pooling, engineered shafts, surveyed tunneling, and industrial milling, a shift from opportunistic mining to structured extraction. The first ore shipments in 1878 confirmed exceptionally rich returns. Output surged into the millions of dollars annually between 1878 and 1880. Bodie's peak production window. Capital flooded inward. Competing firms opened shafts across the Bodie Bluff system. By 1880, between 30 and 50 mining companies were operating simultaneously. The hills surrounding town transformed into a grid of hoists, headframes, and ventilation shafts. This was no longer prospecting. It was industrial throughput. Or moved through a mechanized chain, blasted underground, hoisted by steam winches, crushed in stamp mills, chemically processed, then freighted outward for refining. Each stage required infrastructure, and each layer added cost pressure that only high-grade ore could sustain. Stamp mills defined the skyline. Dozens of iron-shod stamps, some mills operating 20, 30, even 40 stamps, pounded ore day and night. The standard mill, completed in phases and modernized by 1898, stood as one of the district's most advanced processing plants. Multi-level gravity-fed system where ore descended floor by floor through crushing, amalgamation, and concentration. The machinery never rested when ore justified fuel. Steam powered everything initially. Wood-fired boilers drove hoists, drills, and stamps. Fuel consumption was relentless. Forests within hauling distance were cut back aggressively to keep boilers running. Timber demand for both fuel and mine shoring created a dual resource drain. Energy and structural material extracted simultaneously from surrounding terrain. Labor scaled accordingly. Miners drilled by hand in early years, later assisted by steam-powered equipment. Underground conditions were volatile, dust-choked, poorly ventilated, structurally unstable. Cave-ins, boiler bursts, and hoisting failures were occupational constants. Wages hovered between $3 and $4 per day in the late 1870s and 1880s, high enough to attract labor, low enough to maintain margins under rising infrastructure costs. Unionization reflected compression. Miners' Union Local 61 formed in December 1877, part of the Western Federation of Miners Network. Strikes were rare but present, including an 1880 labor action over wage reductions. Even at peak production, companies were already adjusting labor costs downward to offset operational expense. Because Bodie's industrialization came with geographic penalties, everything required import. Machinery, replacement parts, blasting powder, iron fittings, all freighted across long mountain routes. The town sat isolated from major rail corridors. Freight costs inflated every stage of expansion, so companies engineered solutions. In 1881, the Bodie and Benton Narrow Gauge Railroad was constructed, 32 miles linking Bodie to Mono Lake transport routes. It hauled timber, coal, and heavy machinery inward while moving or outward more efficiently than wagon freight alone. Transport infrastructure did not connect Bodie to growth. It connected Bodie to survival. Even power generation evolved under cost pressure. By the early 1890s, Standard Company constructed a hydroelectric plant on Green Creek, 13 miles away. Transmission lines carried electricity directly into Bodie, replacing portions of steam reliance. It was among the earliest long-distance power transmission systems in mining operations. Electricity reduced fuel transport, stabilized mill output, and lowered some operating costs, but required heavy upfront investment. Hydroelectric expansion was not innovation for progress. It was mitigation against geographic expense. Water remained a limiting factor. Reservoirs and small dams captured mountain runoff. Pipes fed mills and town storage tanks. There was no municipal water system, only industrial allocation supplemented by domestic draw. Sanitation infrastructure never materialized. There were no sewers, no waste management systems, because investment flowed toward extraction continuity, not civic livability. Even chemical processing entered the equation. In 1895, cyanide leaching was introduced, allowing companies to extract gold from low-grade ore and tailings. Previously considered waste, it extended mine life temporarily, converting marginal material into profitable yield. But cyanide processing signaled something else. High-grade ore was already diminishing. Companies were investing in recovery technology, not to increase production, but to compensate for declining ore quality. Surface expansion followed the same logic. By the 1930s, firms like Rosecliff Mines employed mechanical shovel mining in open cuts, stripping exposed ore where underground extraction no longer justified cost. Technology did not evolve here for advancement. It evolved for survival, and yet even at peak mechanization, the numbers that mattered were beginning to shift. Hoisting distances increased as mines deepened. Ventilation costs rose. Timber reinforcement expanded. Ore grades dropped. Processing required more material for less return. Industrialization had scaled, Bodie upward, but it had also locked the town into a cost structure that required constant high output to remain viable. The machinery that made Bodie powerful also made it fragile. Because once infrastructure reaches industrial scale, contraction becomes expensive. Mills cannot downsize easily. Rail lines cannot operate partially. Power plants cannot justify output without demand. Industrial towns do not decline gradually. They destabilize when throughput falls below the threshold required to sustain the systems built to support it. And in Bodie, that threshold was approaching faster than the machinery could adapt. Bodie did not urbanize the way permanent towns do. Its infrastructure did not grow outward from civic need. It condensed inward around extraction continuity. By 1879, Main Street stretched nearly a mile. Through the valley floor, a dense, commercial corridor positioned, less for public life and more for labor circulation. Boarding houses, assay offices, saloons, supply stores, and banks aligned themselves along the route miners walked, between shafts and mills. The architecture reflected urgency, not pride. Most buildings were 1- or 2-story wood frames set on shallow stone foundations. Lumber was hauled in at cost, so walls were thin. Facades were decorative illusions, tall false fronts masking narrow structures behind them. They were built to signal commerce, not endure weather. Construction accelerated during the boom years of 1878 to 1880, when population surged toward 8,000, 10,000 people. Hundreds of structures appeared in compressed time. Housing for labor first, business second, civic structures last, because civic investment followed mining profit, never preceded it. Water infrastructure revealed the limits of that growth. Bodie had no integrated municipal supply. Water came from nearby springs and mountain streams, captured in small dams and reservoirs above town. Pipes fed mills and storage tanks through gravity systems prone to freezing, clogging, and seasonal depletion. Early mining had already been constrained by water scarcity. Even at peak production, supply remained fragile, allocated first to ore processing, second to boilers, and only residually to domestic use. There was no sewer system, no sanitation grid. Waste disposal remained localized. Outhouses, trenches, open drainage. Public health infrastructure never justified its cost in a town whose viability depended on ore yield, not population longevity. Power systems followed the same industrial priority. Before electrification, steam engines dominated. Wood-fired boilers driving stamp mills, hoists and ventilation fans. Timber consumption was constant, hauled via freight routes carved into surrounding hills. Then came long-distance electrification. In the early 1890s, Standard Company constructed a hydroelectric plant on Green Creek, 13 miles from town. Transmission lines crossed mountain terrain to deliver power directly into Bodie's mills. Soon after, additional generation infrastructure linked Dynamo Pond on Virginia Creek, nearly 20 miles away, feeding extended transmission systems. Electricity did not modernize Bodie for comfort. It reduced fuel freight costs and stabilized industrial output. Domestic electrification remained minimal. Power flowed to mills first and always. Transportation infrastructure reinforced the same logic. Before rail access, stagecoaches linked Bodie to Bridgeport and Benton, carrying mail, personnel, and light freight through exposed mountain roads. But heavy industry required more. In 1881, the Bodie and Benton Railroad was constructed, a narrow-gauge line spanning 32 miles from Mono, lake transport hubs into Bodie's industrial core. It hauled timber for shoring and fuel, coal for boilers, machinery for mill expansion, and outbound, ore concentrates moving toward refining networks. The railroad did not diversify Bodie's economy. It specialized it further. It existed because extraction volume required mechanical freight, efficiency to remain profitable. Civic structures appeared within this industrial grid, but always secondary. A schoolhouse was built in 1879 after an earlier one, burned. Education following family presence, only after the boom stabilized labor cycles. 2 churches rose between the late 1870s and early 1880s. Methodist and Catholic, their construction funded during peak profitability windows. A jail was erected in 1877 by Constable John Kurgan, law enforcement scaling only once violence threatened labor stability, because crime was not incidental. Between 1878 and 1882, Bodie recorded roughly 70 shootings and 30 murders, a homicide rate far exceeding contemporary urban centers. Law enforcement existed not to civilize, but to keep the workforce operational. The town never incorporated municipally. Legal authority remained in Bridgeport, the Mono County seat. Bodie functioned administratively as an extraction, camp scale to town size, without the governance structures typical of permanent settlements. Banks opened, then closed. The Mono County Bank, organized in 1877, failed by 1884. Bodie Bank opened in 1890, serving mining capital and payroll. Circulation, later robbed in 1916 during the district's declining years. Even financial institutions mirrored or volatility. Communications infrastructure scaled fast. By 1880, Bodie supported daily newspapers, including the Daily, Bodie Standard, and the Daily Free Press. Their circulation reflected population density driven by mining output. Mail service formalized through the Bodie Post Office in 1877, functioning continuously until 1942, long after peak production had passed. Because communication infrastructure lingers longer than profit, volunteer fire companies formed. Up to 4 brigades by 1879, attempting to defend a town built almost entirely of dry timber at high altitude. Cisterns, hoses, and hand pumps were installed across business blocks, but firefighting capacity lagged behind construction density. Screens clogged, pipes froze, pumps failed under pressure. The system existed, but barely kept pace with the risk created by the town's own material design. Because Bodie's urbanization was never engineered holistically, it was layered rapidly. Industrial systems first, civic systems patched in afterward, which meant resilience remained thin. Every structure, every pipe, every transmission line existed to sustain throughput from underground veins to outbound freight. Remove that throughput, and the entire urban framework would lose functional justification. Because Bodie was never balanced, it was calibrated tightly, efficiently, and temporarily around a single economic function. And systems built that narrowly do not adapt well when the force sustaining them begins to weaken. Bodie did not first encounter fire as catastrophe. It encountered fire as consequence. A town built almost entirely from timber, fast cut, fast raised, and densely packed, carried ignition risk from the moment its boom began. False front facades concealed dry framing. Boardwalks linked storefronts like kindling corridors. Soot from coal stoves and boiler ash settled into roof shingles through long winters. Volunteer brigades existed, but so did structural inevitability. Smaller fires struck early. In 1878, flames consumed Sam Chung's restaurant and lodging house on King Street, a localized loss. Absorbed and rebuilt because extraction revenue still justified reconstruction costs. At this stage, fire was treated as interruption, not existential threat. That changed in the 1890s. On July 25, 1892, and some records 1893, Bodie's commercial core ignited. Accounts differ on the origin. What does not differ is the scale. Flames moved block to block across Main Street, consuming business structures built shoulder to shoulder during the boom decade. Volunteer brigades mobilized. Cistern valves were opened. Hydrants were primed, and then the system failed. Screens meant to filter reservoir inlets had been removed for cleaning and not reinstalled. Debris clogged intake lines. Water pressure collapsed. Hoses ran dry while fire advanced through untreated timber facades. The firefighting grid existed on paper. In practice, it could not perform under load. By the time flames subsided, nearly the entire business district had been erased. Saloons, stores, offices, lodging houses reduced to foundations and ash fields. Only a handful of brick or stone structures remained standing. The loss was not just architectural, it was operational. Main Street functioned as Bodie's commercial artery, where payroll circulated. Supplies were acquired, contracts negotiated. Its destruction disrupted labor continuity as much as it erased property. Rebuilding followed, but on altered terms. Businesses returned selectively. Structures were erected smaller. Some lots remained vacant. Investors calculated reconstruction costs against declining or quality and chose restraint. The rebuilt district functioned, but at reduced scale. Fire had exposed something. Investors already suspected that Bodie's profitability window was narrowing. Insurance coverage had been minimal. Losses were borne directly by owners. Capital that might have expanded shafts or modernized mills was diverted into structural replacement. Capital that now required justification from increasingly marginal ore returns. Still, the town endured. Mills ran. Payroll moved. Labor held. For 4 more decades, Bodie continued operating. Smaller, leaner, but intact enough to function. Then fire returned, June 23, 1932. By then, Bodie was already diminished. Population reduced, businesses fewer, mining intermittent. The ignition source was reportedly mundane, a child playing with matches near the remaining commercial strip. The outcome was not. Flames spread through what remained of Main Street, structures already aged, dry and structurally weakened. Fire brigades still existed in name, but manpower was thin. Equipment degraded, water systems unreliable. Once again, inlet screens had not been reinstalled after maintenance. Once again, hydrants failed. Water did not arrive where flame required it. The remaining business district, what had survived decline, consolidation and partial rebuilding, was consumed almost entirely. This time, reconstruction did not follow. The calculation had changed. Ore output no longer justified commercial restoration. Mining firms operated with reduced crews. Supply chains had shifted to external towns. Payroll. Volumes had shrunk below the threshold required to sustain a full business corridor. Main Street had lost economic necessity. After 1932, its destruction was accepted, not resisted. Boarded foundations replaced storefronts. Operations consolidated around remaining industrial sites. Residents adapted to reduce services or relocated entirely. Fire had not destroyed Bodie. It had revealed which parts of Bodie were no longer worth saving. And once commercial infrastructure disappears in an extraction town, population contraction accelerates. Because without supply stores, banks, newspapers, and boarding houses, labor cannot remain concentrated. And without concentrated labor, industrial throughput weakens further. Fire did not initiate Bodie's decline. It exposed the stage of decline the town had already entered, where rebuilding cost more than operational continuity required. From that point forward, every structural loss would be measured not emotionally, but economically. What remained standing did so because it still served extraction. What burned stayed burned. Bodie's population did not grow because the town became livable. It grew because extraction required bodies. Between 1878 and 1880, the peak production window, Bodie's population surged to an estimated 8,000 to 10,000 people. Census precision was difficult in a transient mining district, but density alone confirmed scale. Nearly 250 buildings stood within the valley, housing miners, merchants, freight handlers, and service labor tied directly to ore output. The town's expansion curve mirrored mill throughput. When stamp batteries ran at full capacity, labor demand spiked. When shafts expanded, boarding houses filled. When payrolls rose, commercial streets thickened with supply, stores and saloons, positioned to absorb wages as quickly as they were issued. But Bodie's population structure was narrow. The workforce was overwhelmingly male, transient miners moving between districts as ore booms rose and fell across the American West. Few arrived intending permanence. Contracts, strikes, and rumors of richer veins elsewhere shaped migration patterns more than civic attachment. Housing reflected that instability. Boarding houses outnumbered family homes in early boom years. Rooms were shared, shifts overlapped, and occupancy fluctuated with mine scheduling. Buildings were designed for compression, not comfort. Families did arrive, but only once production stabilized, enough to justify schooling and religious institutions. By the late 1870s, a schoolhouse operated in town. Churches followed, Methodist and Catholic, signaling a partial demographic shift toward settlement. But even this stability remained conditional. If ore declined, families left alongside miners. Ethnic labor segmentation reinforced the system's industrial design. By 1878, Bodie housed several hundred Chinese workers, concentrated in a segregated Chinatown district. Their roles were structurally assigned: laundries, charcoal production, wood cutting, and service trades that supported mining infrastructure, but rarely granted access to claim ownership. Chinese miners had worked placer fields in earlier California boom, but by Bodie's peak, they were largely excluded from quartz claims that drove industrial extraction. They remained essential to operational continuity, but peripheral to profit participation. European immigrant labor filled underground roles: Irish, Cornish, Italian miners bringing hard rock experience from older mining regions. Skill stratification emerged quickly. Experienced miners commanded steadier wages, while unskilled arrivals cycled through lower-paying or more hazardous assignments. Labor organization followed cost pressure. On December 22, 1877, miners formed Miners' Union Local 61 under the Western Federation of Miners, not as social solidarity, but as wage defense within an increasingly industrialized system. Because even during peak output, companies were already tightening compensation. Wages averaged $3 to $4 per day, competitive enough to attract labor, but constantly negotiated against rising infrastructure and freight costs. In 1880, at least one miners' strike erupted over wage reductions, a signal that corporate operators were recalibrating labor expense even while production remained high. Because extraction towns operate on compressed margins, when timber costs rise, when freight rates climb, when ore grades dip slightly, labor becomes the most adjustable variable. Working conditions reinforced volatility. Underground temperatures fluctuated sharply. Ventilation was inconsistent. Dust inhalation, shaft collapses, and hoisting accidents were routine. Fatalities were not isolated incidents, they were occupational constants. Winter amplified risk above ground. The winter of 1878-79 brought extreme conditions, snowfall measured in tens of feet, temperatures plunging near 30 degrees, dozens of new arrivals, unprepared for high-altitude exposure, died from cold and disease. Environment filtered labor as harshly as the mines did. And yet, even under these pressures, population held, because ore output still justified risk. But once output narrowed, population contraction followed immediately. By 1883, barely 3 years after peak, nearly all major mines outside Bodie and Standard had closed. Labor demand collapsed in tandem. Miners relocated to emerging districts across Nevada and California where richer veins promised better returns. Boarding houses emptied. Supply stores reduced stock. Commercial payroll circulation slowed. By 1886, population had already fallen to roughly 1/580%. Contraction from peak density within a single decade. Families left alongside single laborers. Schools lost enrollment. Church attendance thinned. Newspaper circulation dropped. Because civic systems scale only when labor concentration remains stable. And Bodie's labor concentration was never stable. It was conditional. By 1900, fewer than 500 residents remained. Those who stayed were tied directly to the surviving consolidated operations, often employees of the Standard Consolidated Mining Company or later leaseholders. The town was no longer attracting workers. It was retaining only those still required to keep machinery running. Population did not taper gradually. It stepped down in sharp drops aligned to mine closures, ore exhaustion, and infrastructure consolidation. Because in extraction economies, people do not leave when towns become uncomfortable. They leave when payroll disappears. And in Bodie, payroll was already shrinking, long before the final mines shut, long before the last freight lines went quiet. The labor force that had built the town's density was already dispersing, following capital outward the same way it had once followed it in. Because workforce loyalty in extraction systems is never geographic, it is economic. And once Bodie's margins tightened enough to compress wages, reduce shifts and idle shafts, the human infrastructure that sustained the town began withdrawing, rapidly, mechanically, and without sentiment. Population had built Bodie's scale. Its departure would expose how little structural weight the town could carry on its own. Bodie did not fail because commerce was absent. It failed because commerce expanded beyond what extraction could sustain. At peak density, between 1878 and 1881, Bodie's commercial district rivaled established Western cities in service concentration relative to population size. Nearly every structure along Main Street monetized mining payroll in some form. Saloons dominated frontage. Contemporary counts estimate over 60 drinking establishments operating simultaneously, an extraordinary ratio even by frontier standards. They were not merely social venues. They functioned as wage recapture mechanisms, positioned to absorb liquidity within hours of mill disbursement, because miners were paid in cash. And cash in extraction towns circulates fastest where permanence is lowest. Gambling halls operated adjacent to saloon, faro, poker, roulette, systems mathematically calibrated to redirect wages back into commercial ownership. Dance halls and brothels followed the same economic gravity. Bodie's red light district expanded rapidly during the boom years, not as moral deviation, but as predictable service, infrastructure in a male-dominated labor economy with disposable income and minimal domestic settlement. Vice was not peripheral. It was structurally embedded in payroll circulation. Retail density mirrored the same overexpansion. General stores, assay offices, blacksmiths, bootmakers, tailors, and equipment suppliers lined commercial corridors sized not for Bodie's long-term population, but for its peak extraction throughput. Merchants stocked inventory assuming ore output would remain stable for decades. Imported goods traveled hundreds of miles by wagon. Flour, canned food, machinery parts, textiles, all priced against freight costs that required high sales volume to remain viable. When mines ran continuously, the system worked. Freight caravans arrived weekly, shelves emptied quickly. Credit systems extended against expected payroll continuity, because commercial confidence was indexed to ore, not to savings. Financial institutions followed expansion. Wells Fargo established an office in Bodie, managing bullion shipments, payroll security, and private deposits tied directly to mining revenue streams. Gold and silver left town under armed transport. Currency flowed back in as wages. It created the illusion of a closed economic loop. But the loop depended entirely on uninterrupted extraction. Fire insurance firms, legal offices, and land brokers entered the district and secondary. Industries that only emerge when investors believe a town has crossed from boom camp into permanence. Real estate speculation intensified by 1880. Commercial lots along Main Street commanded inflated prices, justified by foot traffic and sales volume tied to mine output projections. Buildings grew more elaborate. False front wooden structures gave way, and in some cases, to brick facades designed to signal stability to investors and incoming merchants. But permanent signaling does not create permanence. It only masks volatility while margins remain high. Commercial credit expansion became the system's hidden risk layer. Merchants extended goods on tab to miners awaiting payroll. Suppliers extended inventory on credit to merchants expecting continued demand. Freight contractors extended delivery lines assuming ongoing bulk orders. The entire commercial grid rested on projected ore that had not yet been extracted. When ore grades began narrowing in the early 1880s, commercial contraction did not begin immediately. Because surface indicators lagged underground reality, saloons still filled at night, stores still stocked inventory, freight still arrived on schedule, but liquidity began thinning beneath the surface. Miners spent less between pay cycles. Tabs took longer to clear. Merchants delayed supplier payments. Credit chains lengthened, a classic compression signal in extraction. Economies approaching output decline. Then closures began. Not all at once, but in patterned sequence. First went speculative ventures, luxury goods, specialty retailers, high-risk entertainment halls dependent on excess wage flow. Then smaller saloons consolidated or shuttered as foot traffic thinned. Freight deliveries reduced frequency, shifting from weekly to monthly in some sectors as bulk orders declined. Inventory stagnated on shelves, perishable goods spoiled. Import costs rose per unit as volume dropped. Commercial density, once Bodie's symbol of prosperity, it became its liability, because fixed structures cannot downscale as quickly as payroll contracts. Leases still required payment. Buildings still required maintenance. Insurance premiums did not adjust to declining revenue. And fire risk, ever present in wooden. Frontier towns made vacant structures, financial hazards rather than neutral assets. Major fires accelerated contraction. The fire of 1892 destroyed a significant portion of Bodie's business district. Over 60 structures lost. In earlier boom years, such destruction would have triggered immediate reconstruction financed by mining profits. But by the 1890s, capital reinvestment appetite had evaporated. Many buildings were never rebuilt. Empty lots replaced commercial rows. Gaps appeared in what had once been continuous economic frontage. Commercial silence began spreading block by block. By the mid-1890s, Bodie no longer functioned as a full-spectrum service economy. Remaining businesses operated in survival mode, reduced hours, smaller inventories, cash-only transactions, replacing credit systems that had collapsed under unpaid tabs. Wells Fargo eventually closed its Bodie office as bullion shipments dwindled. Without bullion flow, Security infrastructure dissolved. Without payroll liquidity, retail ecosystems thinned further. Because commerce in extraction towns does not create wealth independently, it recycles it. And once ore output declined past the threshold required to sustain payroll density, the commercial superstructure built to absorb those wages became oversized, underfunded, and structurally unsustainable. Main Street did not empty overnight. It hollowed gradually, lights going dark one storefront at a time. False fronts remained standing, but behind them rooms sat vacant. Shelves gathered dust. Ledger books closed permanently, because Bodie's commercial boom had never been calibrated to population permanence. It had been calibrated to extraction intensity, and when extraction slowed, the illusion of urban prosperity dissolved with it, revealing that the town's economic diversity had never been real. It had always been a single industry feedback loop, expanding and contracting in perfect synchronization with the mines beneath it. Bodie's decline was not random. It was programmed by diminishing returns, rising costs, and systemic inertia. By the late 1880s, bonanza ore had been extracted. High-grade veins in Bodie Bluff, the lifeblood of Standard and Bodie mines, were exhausted. The easy ore was gone. Operations shifted to lower-grade seams. Costs rose mechanically. Timber for boilers and construction cost up to $1 per cord. Astronomical for marginal mines. Freight remained high, sourced over mountains from Mono Lake and distant supply points. Labor contracts persisted, but wages competed with declining ore returns. Mining companies faced three hard realities simultaneously. Ore required longer hoisting distances. Grades were lower. Infrastructure maintenance did not scale down easily. The Standard consolidated. Mining company merged in 1887 to consolidate resources, attempting economies of scale. It was not survival of ingenuity. It was survival by eliminating redundant overhead. Other operators shut down entirely. By 1883, nearly all smaller mines had ceased production. Only Bodie and Standard remained in continuous operation. Commercial systems, freight lines, and payrolls recalibrated downward in tandem. Boarding houses consolidated. Saloon owners closed shops. Newspapers folded. Wells Fargo reduced shipments. Each collapse fed the next. The 1893 silver crash amplified mechanical decline. Prices fell globally. Margins evaporated. What had been marginally profitable mining became outright loss. The 1892 fire had already reduced Main Street's commercial footprint. The financial shock of rebuilding, combined with falling ore grades, convinced operators to curtail reconstruction. Diminishing returns were now structural, not temporary. Small firms liquidated assets. Equipment was abandoned or sold for scrap. Labor contracts ended. Transient miners departed for richer districts in Nevada and California. By the turn of the century, Bodie's population had shrunk below 500. Most remaining residents were attached directly to ongoing leases, employees of J.S. Kane, or operators of the last productive shafts. Production persisted, but only at minimal levels. Secondary industries, freight, retail, entertainment, operated only to support this minimal extraction. Payroll dictated life. Infrastructure persisted mechanically, but without redundancy. During the 1920s and 1930s, operations focused on tailings and marginal dumps. The Rosecliff Mines Co-operative formed in 1935, ran a 500-ton-per-day cyanide mill. Mechanically efficient, but economically fragile. It relied on precise coordination of labor, power, and ore. Any disruption, fire, weather, or machinery breakdown, threatened viability. It did not take long. April 30th, 1942, the War Production Board prohibited gold mining as non-essential. Extraction ceased. Payroll disappeared. Labor dispersed. Freight stopped. Even surviving infrastructure, mills, hoists, water lines, hydroelectric transmission became idle. Systems no longer required human input for continuity. They remained, but deactivated. The last commercial and civic functions, post office, newspapers, minor retail, shut down by the early 1940s. Only a handful of caretakers remained, maintaining minimal operational presence. Bodie was no longer a town. It was a collection of dormant machinery, standing structures, and unserviced systems, a deactivated extraction network, frozen mid-function, awaiting preservation intervention decades later. Every closure, every halted shaft, Every boarded storefront was calculated by the simple arithmetic of cost versus return. Sentiment had no influence. Survival was dictated by what the system could justify economically, not by what residents wanted or imagined. Bodie did not die. It ran out of economic fuel. Bodie survived because it was cheaper to stabilize than to dismantle or rebuild. By 1962, after 2 decades of mechanical and economic inertia, the state declared Bodie a California State Historic Park and a National Historic Landmark. The decision was pragmatic, structural, and deliberate. No new construction was permitted. No restoration beyond stabilization was allowed. Every intervention focused on preventing collapse, not reactivating systems. Roofs were patched where holes threatened timber framing. Chimneys were repointed. Sagging walls were shored up. Materials were retained in place. Original boards, nails, and stone were left. Floors were reinforced only where necessary for safety. Interiors, shelves, signage, some furniture, were left as they had been in 1942. The goal was arrested decay, not authenticity for the sake of nostalgia. Bodie's survival was a calculated exercise in cost containment and control of hazard, not historical storytelling. The policy acknowledged environmental and structural pressures, freeze-thaw cycles, windstorms exceeding 100 mph, heavy snow. These forces continued to degrade wood and mortar. Stabilization slowed degradation. It did not reverse it. Staff and donors maintained the site selectively. Fencing, vegetation control, roof repairs, minimal intervention, targeting only imminent structural failure. Infrastructure remained inert. Water tanks were empty. Mill wheels did not turn. Hoists did not operate. Power lines carried no current. Buildings stood because dismantling cost more than leaving them intact. Systems remained mechanically frozen, suspended mid-function, telling only the story of operational logic, not human life. Bodie's survival became an extension of the extraction system's final principle. Retain structural elements as long as it is economical. Without restoring function, no new inhabitants arrived. No industrial activity restarted. The site remained a framework, visible, comprehensible, but devoid of operational purpose. The deliberate act of preservation solidified Bodie as a static system. It exists today not because people wanted to remember, not because architecture endured, but because economic logic dictated it was easier to maintain what remained than to erase it. Every roof patched, beam bolstered, and wall shored reflects structural control imposed over functional obsolescence. Bodie did not survive by accident. It survived by calculation. Bodie did not fade because people forgot it. It did not vanish because it lacked charm or because folklore abandoned it. It ceased to operate because the system that built it, mines, mills, labor, freight, water, and power, ran out of economic justification. Structures remain. Roofs, walls, foundations, rails, and cisterns endure, but they serve no function. Machines are silent. Water does not flow. Payrolls are gone. Human labor is absent. The town was never designed to last. Its scale, density, and apparent permanence were conditional outputs of extraction, calibrated to ore, not community. Preservation is not nostalgia. It is mechanical, calculated, and final. Bodie exists because it was cheaper to stabilize than to erase, an artifact of industrial logic frozen mid-cycle. Ask yourself, if Bodie had never been preserved, would we still be standing here looking at its skeleton today? Or would it have collapsed entirely, leaving nothing but the valley and memory? Every timber, every false front, every silent mill tells the same truth. Industrial systems operate only as long as they are justified by extraction and cost. When justification ends, so does function, and all that remains is structure. If you want to explore more places where industrial ambition meets inevitable collapse, or systems like Kennecott, Fordlandia, and Cahaba, and understand why structures survive long after purpose disappears, subscribe now. Because Bodie is not just history. It is a mechanical lesson, frozen in time, waiting to teach us how economies, labor, and infrastructure fail without warning, without sentiment, and without pause.